Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host. It is a great privilege and blessing. We have Mr. Richard Ennis as a returning guest, Secretary of It. Well, I told him before the interview I was not going to refer to him as the Secretary of Education, and what's the first thing flying out of my mouth? He's an education analyst at the Bluegrass Institute. And brother, before we end the interview, I'd like you just to touch upon a little bit what is the Bluegrass Institute. But before we do that, let's do a quick review, summation of what we discussed the last time. I think you had said to us that Kentucky is not doing a good job in preparing our young people for furthering their education beyond grade 12, and that we really haven't made much progress in the past 30 years. Is that correct?
That sadly is very correct. So whether we look at results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a federal testing program that is ongoing from 1992, depending on the subject and grade level, up to the present, or we look at the ACT college entrance test results, astonishingly low numbers of our children are being adequately prepared for what they need to know to succeed in life. Reading is the most disturbing example of all. For African American Kentucky students, the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress from 2019, which is pre-COVID, showed only 14% of the state's Black students were adequately prepared and were reading at a proficient level. Just 14%.
Wow.
It's just depressing. And numbers we get from the ACT aren't that much different. The two testing systems tend to agree. Even for our white students who have made a little progress in reading, the amount of progress they've made is totally inadequate compared to where we need to have them. And as of 2019, only 39% of our white students were adequately prepared in reading. And even worse, that is down from where it was a couple of earlier test cycles back in 2015. We're actually losing ground. We're not moving forward anymore. We're going backwards, and that's pre-COVID. So the bottom line is our education system, over the 30 years of very expensive reform efforts that came after the Kentucky Education Reform Act of 1990 was passed, has not produced anything close to what we really need. So that's the reality.
How does that impact, I don't know how to put this, college enrollment and college graduation rates?
It has a big impact on college, obviously. If a student cannot read well enough to survive, even in the non-technical college courses, they're not going to survive in college, and it impacts the graduation rates from college. Obviously, a lot of students won't even apply to college because they realize from their past performance that they're not going to succeed. But even among those that do, I think only about half are successfully graduating after 6 years, not 4 years, but 6 years in the college environment. That's pretty bad. And considering about roughly half of our kids are going on to college, it's a little more than that. But putting all that together, only about a quarter of the kids that start out in K to 12 are making it through to a college degree right now. That's something our economy is not going to survive with well. But even worse, getting back to reading, the ACT, the people who do the college entrance test, have done a lot of other research. They actually work with business and industry and have created tests for them to make sure that people coming into non-college track jobs have enough education to make it through their apprenticeship programs, for example. And ACT is now saying that, based on some research they did in 2015, that living wage, non-college track jobs now require pretty much the same kind of basic skills in math and reading that a freshman in college needs. So the ACT test is no longer telling us, well, these kids aren't very well prepared for college. They're telling us these kids aren't really very well prepared to survive in life. It's
Wow.
a serious situation. We're setting a lot of our kids up. We did some research at the Bluegrass Institute. We put a report out um, over the summer about what Milton Wright knew about reading that a lot of our teachers apparently don't. And in there, we worked an estimate from the test results from the NAEP, as we call the federal test program, and ACT. We estimated, and it's a pretty good estimate, I'm told, that 200,000 of our students in the K to 12 enrollment in our public schools, 200,000 are reading at a level that the federal test would describe as not even partial mastery of reading, not even partial. To me, that means they're basically non-readers.
Right.
That's not going to be a good condition for them when they graduate from high school. And tens of thousands each year are coming out in that category based on ACT results that we're getting. It's a super, super serious problem.
Right.
It has massive implications for the future of our economy. We have got to fix this.
Now, I'm not trying to get too political here, but, of late, I get a lot. I do several interviews on critical race theory, and I get a lot of response to that. A lot of my listeners really jump on that. Help me connect the dots here. I hear a lot of educators here in Louisville. They really, really want that critical race theory curriculum, whatever, in the school system. A lot of Board of Education members, they want that. Is there any way that critical race theory can help boost these reading skills, these reading proficiency tests?
Well, one of the problems we have when people are talking about critical race theory, everybody thinks it means something different. It's not well defined as it is being popularly used today. What most members of the public actually think critical race theory is now is inappropriate teaching practices. Now, inappropriate teaching practices doesn't necessarily mean teaching an accurate factual history of what happened in this country, which includes teaching about slavery and its implications and the things that happened after the Civil War was fought.
Mm-hmm.
That is not inappropriate, but that's not what bothers people. What bothers people is taking kids in elementary school, dividing them up into two groups by race, and telling the group of white kids, well, you're the oppressors, and telling the kids of color, well, you're the people who've been oppressed and bullied and treated badly, and winding up really not giving these kids useful and positive information, but making them feel like they're either evil or they're oppressed, and the oppressed ones feel like, well, gee, there's no hope for us. We've always been put down. It'll never change. And the white kids come home crying to mom, I'm an evil person. That's not positive.
Right.
And the problem is there are classrooms where that's happening. I'm not saying it happens in every classroom. Right now, what goes on in classrooms across the country is very uncontrolled. And it's more uncontrolled here in Kentucky than maybe anywhere else, especially in this area, which gets into the area of social studies. Now, we do have a printed document in the state of Kentucky put out by the Kentucky Department of Education and approved by the legislature through the regulatory approval process called the Kentucky Academics for Social Studies. And I've spent quite a bit of time on this, and it touches on a whole bunch of things that are important and relate, I think, to this discussion we're having now about this inappropriate teaching issue. And let's talk a little bit about social studies standards in Kentucky.
Yes.
They are horrible. They are vacuous and incomplete, which opens up the door, unfortunately, for people to come in talking about, we're going to teach something we are calling critical race theory, but whatever they're teaching may not be the right stuff because the social studies document doesn't give them enough guidance about what the right stuff really is. Let me give you an example. We'll start right at the top. Now, the National Council for the social studies says that there's actually about 13 different strands or disciplines that should be included in a good, solid social studies program. And those include civics, geography, economics, history, anthropology, archaeology, the law, philosophy, political science, psychology, religion, sociology, and the humanities. All that's in social studies. Otherwise, it's not covered in our curriculum at all because it's not covered in science, not covered in math, not covered in reading. Mm-hmm. But at the beginning of the Kentucky Social Studies document, it says they're only going to cover 4 strands, not 13, just 4. The only ones they mention are civics, geography, economics, and history. Things like the law and religion and sociology, not mentioned at all. So does that mean our kids are only going to get 4/13 of the education the kids in other states are going to get on social studies? Maybe so. Now, when you dig into the document, it gets a lot worse. I think most of your listeners are well enough informed to know that one of the most important presidents who ever served our nation, Abraham Lincoln, was born here in Kentucky.
Yes.
We even have a national park at the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln. I visited it. There's a model log cabin similar to the one he was actually born in. It's not the actual one, but it's in there inside a shrine building for this most important president that we ever maybe had in the country, certainly one of the most. Don't you think Abraham Lincoln should be mentioned as a subject for specific discussion in Kentucky social studies standards?
Absolutely. Yes.
I defy you to find his name. I've looked through it using, the search feature in Adobe Acrobat. It's a Adobe Acrobat PDF document. Abraham Lincoln is not in this document anywhere. Never mentioned. In fact, only 5 historical personalities from all time are mentioned in the document. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are mentioned. Sam Adams is mentioned, the revolutionary leader, but not President John Adams or his son John Quincy Adams. Only Sam Adams. I guess the teachers knew about the beer. But the only 2 others are Henry Clay and Daniel Boone. That's it. None of the other presidents, including some pretty significant ones that have had big impact on what's happened in this country, none of them are mentioned. Not one. Mm-hmm. And you will be told by teachers, oh, yeah, but we're going to talk about Lincoln because we have to talk about the Civil War. And the Civil War is briefly mentioned in the document, although a whole lot of detail about what's going to be covered in the Civil War is also notoriously absent. So coverage is going to vary on that widely from school to school and even classroom to classroom, because there's not enough guidance in this document to make sure that our kids will get a common core that is consistent across the state. That doesn't mean teachers shouldn't have the ability to put some individual stuff about things they're personally interested in, but there should be a common core that's fairly detailed information that all of our kids get. And it's not in this document. It's not there. It's not going to happen. There's just so much missing. It's amazing. But since Lincoln is not specifically mentioned, if you only cover Lincoln during the Civil War years, what happens to the important American exceptionalism story about how our country allowed a backwoodsman with no education when he started to basically largely self-educate, rise to become a lawyer and a very skilled politician, and eventually lead our country in one of its most challenging times in its entire history.
Yes.
With success. That's an American exceptionalism story. And because his name's not mentioned, and because much of his story, his personal story, obviously came before the Civil War even started, and technically his death came after the Civil War had ended.
Yes.
A great deal of his story isn't going to be told in every classroom. At least it doesn't have to be. It might be, or it might not be. How can you tell? This document doesn't ensure that happens. Amazing what else is left out. The discussion of inventions is basically like a one-sentence thing. Let's talk about inventions from all times. Can you tell me which inventions are going to be covered in every classroom when you say it that way? Can you tell me which important American inventions, again, which gets into the American exceptionalism story, are going to be mentioned? You see that they never mention Alexander Graham Bell or the telephone. They never mention one of my favorite safety engineers, a guy named George Westinghouse, who invented the air brakes, which made rail travel much safer and which are still used on trucks today, by the way. They never mention Thomas Edison, who created motion pictures and electric lighting and a whole host of other important inventions. Morse and his telegraph weren't mentioned. The Wright brothers and their important discoveries. And that's another American exceptionalism story. Two bicycle mechanics beat some of the most sophisticated and well-financed technical engineers in the country under Dr. Langley, who were given $50,000 by the US government to develop an airplane, and the Wright brothers beat them to the punch. In fact, Langley never did discover the key element, which the Wrights did, to the fact that you need 3 axes of control to keep an airplane under control in flight, not 2, you need 3. And Langley never discovered that, so he never had a practical design. All of those stories are totally omitted because neither the inventions nor the inventors are mentioned. That's very sad. It robs our children of the assurance they will learn about important parts of our history. The other stuff that's missing, unbelievable. There are very few wars mentioned in this document. There are some. They mention the American Revolution and the Civil War is mentioned, and World War I and World War II get coverage, and so does the Spanish-American War. Mm-hmm. But there isn't anything said about the War of 1812. There isn't anything said about the Mexican-American War or the Texas War of Independence. And in a great shock to me, because I'm a Vietnam War vet, and to other vets who are still living for the most part, not one single war after World War II is ever mentioned. Wow. In fact, the country of Vietnam and many other countries, in fact, the entire continent of South America is ignored, not mentioned. What kind of a social studies education is that? Some examples of how this country expanded. We did some unique things in this country. We didn't get all of our land through war and conquest. In fact, a lot of it was obtained through peaceful purchase and negotiation with other countries. The Louisiana Purchase, a huge expansion of our land, was peaceful. It was a purchase. The Alaska Purchase, peaceful. The Gadsden Purchase, we needed a way around the mountains out west for a railroad. We did that peacefully with Mexico instead of fighting them for it. We paid them for it. Those are all peaceful expansions, and none of them are mentioned, and neither is the Lewis and Clark expedition, which is a fantastic story, another American exceptionalism story. There's nothing about them either, which of course was a consequence of the Louisiana Purchase. We needed to find out what we really had bought. Things hadn't been very well surveyed back then. All of that is gone. It's not mentioned anywhere. The stuff that's mentioned is so brief and incomplete, it just makes you weep. Some of the people that are left out are unbelievable. Now, a state with really high quality standards is Massachusetts. And I went through a listing of people who are mentioned in there, and there are a lot of them. They were able to make a decision about who's really important and who kids need to learn about. Our teachers who created our social studies standards weren't willing to make those decisions. But I already mentioned a couple of them. Some of the great industrialists like Andrew Carnegie and Cornelius Vanderbilt, they're mentioned in Massachusetts. They're not covered at all. And others. Harriet Tubman's not mentioned, for goodness sakes. And John Dewey, who was very influential in education. He's not mentioned in Kentucky standards. And it goes on like that. Benjamin Franklin's not mentioned in Kentucky standards.
Whoa.
What kind of a civics lesson are we going to give our kids when we don't give them the surrounding history about how our government was formed and who did it?
Right.
That's what's missing in this vacuous,
you
horrible
said,
document.
And you mentioned, you said American exceptionalism, but what I also heard was free markets, entrepreneurs, how valuable that is to how we created one of the wealthiest, most prosperous societies ever.
I agree. Let me give you some terms that kind of go counter to that to get back to the civics lesson that you just triggered my mind on. How are you going to really teach American children the full story about our way of life, which includes capitalism that you're talking about, and totally ignore, are you ready for this? Socialism, communism, and even Nazism.
Yes.
None of those terms appear in this document anywhere.
Whoa. No.
You want to talk about a cover-up and an inexcusable piece of work. This is it. Who are these people? How could anyone feel they were competent to create something when they created this? I'm sorry, they weren't.
Right. No,
there is no mention of those things. Those are critical things our kids need to know about. And a lot of our young adults now do not fully understand the dangers of communism and socialism. And a lot of them think, oh, we ought to do that. Well, by golly, there's a lot of people who emigrated here from Russia who would say not only no, but heck no. And ditto for anybody who emigrated from any of the other satellite countries or other areas of the world that have been under the communist thumb. But our kids are ignorant, and they're going to stay ignorant if this document isn't changed.
Yes. Let me say this real quick before we continue. This is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host. We have with us today Mr. Richard Ennis of the Bluegrass Institute. Brother, I called you Roy Ennis. You know who I was thinking about when I called you Roy Ennis, old school civil rights guy. But this is Richard Ennis with the Bluegrass Institute, Book Talk with Corbin. Folks, I have another interview with this gentleman at my website. It's posted on my website, booktalkwithcorbin.com. You definitely have to go to that interview, listen to that, and then come back to this. And if you don't come back concerned, then I can't help you. So I don't know what else we could say. I don't know what else we can say. Brother, before we stop here, could you talk a little bit about the Bluegrass Institute? I've heard about them for a while, but I didn't know a lot about them.
I'd be glad to do that. Bluegrass Institute is Kentucky's first and most prominent free market think tank. We like to look at ideas from the private sector and also from other states, even in the public sector, that are working well for those institutions and that we think could also work well to guide our public policy here in Kentucky to make Kentucky a better place for all of us to live and work. And we bring that intelligence together. We have a number of scholars who support us, a number of economists from around the state, and educators. Dr. Gary Houchins is an educator who is one of our scholars, and Dr. John Guerin, who's a very noted economist at the University of Kentucky, for example, is another one of our scholars. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I do a lot of work and research, and we have a really gifted team of staff members who are experienced in public policy and in assisting legislators in developing better public policy. And our job is to come up with suggestions to improve Kentucky for everyone. And that's our primary mission. We're totally non-government funded. We don't take a penny of government money. So we're not beholden to anybody in the state or federal government who would influence our thought processes or try to limit what we do. We are very independent that way. We do accept private donations, and we certainly need them to survive. And if anybody's interested, we're always happy to receive that help.
What's your website?
It's www.B as in boy, I as in India, P as in Papa, another P as in Papa, S as in Sierra.org. It's bips.org. Okay. And you'll be able to find a lot of information there and giving information and so forth. We have a blog. We have lots of reports that we've issued. And I think all of that is available pretty easily to the public. And certainly we like to hear from the public. If they have questions, oftentimes that will aim us in a new direction that we want to examine. We appreciate the feedback.
Can people make a donation at the website?
I believe there is a feature right in the website to do that.
All right.
And if not, there should be contact information where they can find out more.
And I'm assuming that if someone wants to donate $5 million, $5,000, or $5, they're free to do it. However much they can afford.
We will take any donation people are willing to give us. Obviously, the more the better, but there's no donation too small. We're happy to receive whatever people can support us with.
Yeah, fantastic. Brother, we need to conclude here. Thank you so much for coming back a second time. I really appreciate you. And please contact me if you've got something that you really would like to, share with my listeners.
I'll put a teaser out there. We have a major problem with reading in this state. We've done a lot of research on it, and we've just discovered some examples of a school district in Kentucky that is producing phenomenally high reading scores on the state's K-Prep test, although they have phenomenally high poverty. And if you get me back another time, we want to talk about that story because it says that, yes, Kentucky, we can do better. We don't have to settle for this. We don't have to accept the argument that, oh, we're too poor, our kids will never perform. Right. It's happening right now, right here in the Bluegrass state. We just have to get more people on board with it.
That's fantastic. That's a great teaser, brother. We're definitely going to make that arrangement for that interview and that subject. Brother, thank you so much. Let's stay in touch.